Okay, so we're going to continue talking about inequality, and this time we're going to talk about um, racial inequality and how sociologists understand race in society. One of the major theories that's out there on race is the social construction, or the racial formation theory. Um, so if you want to go back to the lecture on social construction theory, that might help you with this theory as well, just as a backdrop, because this is where we get the theory from. So with racial formation theory, the first step is that we acknowledge race as a social construct, something that's already a fact of life, that's out there. Remember, in social construction theory, there's a social world that exists the moment that you enter the world. You don't really have a choice about it. So race as a social construct, performs in that way. It's something that's out there. It's not natural, however, but it exists as a social category. So that's what we're interested in as far as race, is the social aspect of how race works in society. Another note, too, is that race is not something that's necessarily static, but rather it shifts meaning over time and within different contexts. So, for example, in the United States, Irish were once considered black, and when they first immigrated in the late 1800s, and then slowly over time they became white. So this sort of social construction is very interesting because it can change or shift over time. Nothing necessarily has to stay the same. In fact, one of the things that we're seeing is a lot of transnational immigration happening from one country to the next, and so understanding race has become that much more important. For instance, a person from the Philippines is a really interesting case, because in the U.S., someone from the Philippines is considered Asian, but in the UK or Britain, they are considered black. Until very recently, Asian has become a category there, but that's fairly recent. In Brazil, a person from the Philippines would be considered brown or moreno. In South Africa, a person from the Philippines is considered white. And in the Philippines, it's based on ethnicity, so it's Tagalog or Basayan, which is a mixed-race person composed of two regional ethnicities. So you can see how the race as a social construct does really depend on the historical time and the place as a way to determine that. And as a last point, then, as a social construct, race is, you can't change it. Like, one person cannot change it. It's something that we all agree upon, or we all act upon as being real. So one person, we would argue, would not be able to change the social construct. We'll argue for change later on in the model, but it's not going to be based on one person. Okay, so the second point with racial formation theory is that yes, there are social constructs, but they all have meaning. So race has social meaning. Usually that produces racial characteristics and stereotypes. And it's usually done at the institutional level. So we have categories such as white man can't jump, Asians are good at math, and media definitely plays a major role in this. Also textbooks, with education and family. So when we talk about the institutional level, that's what we're talking about: media, education, family. One of the ways in which we understand race is through socialization. So social construction theory is about socialization. It's about how we learn how to be a social person. So through the media, through schooling, we learn and internalize ideas about race. Now, the important thing about racial formation theory is that it is something that impacts everyone. Anyone who exists in a society is socialized in some way about race. And what you do with that, of course, is dependent on your family or other influences, but we're all exposed to the idea of race and what it means to be black or be white or Asian or Latino. So this is where we start to come in with reproducing stereotypes. So we access or learn about race and differences between race, but then we can also contribute to the social construct of race through reproducing stereotypes through jokes or stories, or consuming images and products without critically thinking about the implications of certain ideas about race. The fourth step is that racial ideas are often maintained through policies. So it's not just about attitude, about the way people think about race, but rather certain policies reinforce stereotypes too. So, for example, affirmative action or housing laws were put in place to prevent policies of discrimination. We also see practices such as following black kids in the store, where you wouldn't necessarily do that with a white man or something of that nature. So how do we understand, race? Well, a lot of it has to do with policies, practices, and laws. There are certain curfew laws that are in place in certain neighborhoods that are primarily made up of minorities. Also, redlining was a huge issue in certain cities where realtors would only show certain houses to black people so that they wouldn't live in neighborhoods that white people didn't want them to. So this was a very popular policy or law that was in place that allowed for that kind of practice to happen. Of course, now it's illegal, but it still happens today. And also individuals. Ideas are also maintained through people, through individuals, action based on what we know, what we think to be true. So we kind of have to ask, well, who does this benefit? Why would we have these policies, practices, or laws, or individuals? Usually, it can come down to money. You think you make more money if you practice a certain business a certain way. You could always justify why certain policies should be in place. Identity politics is a way to preserve your sense of self. There's a lot of rationality for why things are kept the way they are. But at this point, the process can stop here as far as maintaining stereotypes, maintaining racist practices. Doesn't necessarily have to change. So the next few steps here are about how do we change and challenge stereotypes in a way that we can redeem these sort of social constructs as they stand today. So in trying to change the way things are done in terms of race relations, one way we can do it is through groups or institutions challenging stereotypes, realizing that there's an imperfect fit between the stereotype and reality. So there might be a judgment on women, but it doesn't really represent who women are, or a certain racial group that you might have a stereotype. Of course, it doesn't really fit all people of that particular race, and understanding that it's just a stereotype and that it shouldn't function as something real in the way that we relate to one another. Realize the harm that's done and who benefits, that race and racism, the way it's being practiced, causes social oppression. Form organizations, coalitions, protests, boycotts, and any legal challenge as a way to deconstruct these stereotypes, especially as they cause harm to individuals and groups of people. And then help to create new images, call the bluff on socialization, that we don't have to internalize these images, so that we can actually change them and bring in a more positive spin on our sense of identity, ethnic or racial identity. The sixth step is how challenge can lead to change. And this is really important that we understand change from above and from below. So when we talk about challenge from above, we're talking about policies and laws that can be changed, making certain practices illegal. And then there's also change from below, which is changing your attitude, changing your behavior, changing the way that you relate to other people. That this is important too, that it can't just be a law, it has to be about changing people's attitudes as well. So that's racial formation theory.